Today we're going to study Parshat Zachor, which is always read the Shabbos before Purim. And it reminds us to remember, it's a commandment to remember that which Amalek tried to do to us when we were leaving Egypt, when we were on the journey, when we left Egypt. I'm going to read the passage for everybody, so just so you're reminded of it. Then what we're going to do is I'm going to share two teachings that I heard in Israel this past week on my trip to Israel, two powerful teachings. Then after that, I'm going to share some of the teachings about the obligation to remember and also some of the commentary on it. But first, let's just review the verses so we remember it. We remember what we're commanded to remember. Zachor, chapter 25 of Deuteronomy, verse 17. Zachor, remember, Et asher asalacha Amalek. Remember what Amalek did to you. Well, what did they do to us? When we read about it a few weeks ago in Parashat Peshalach, and we were on the road, they attacked us. So remember that which they did to us. Seems a little bit insufficient because other nations have attacked us, and we're only remembering what Amalek did. What they did to us, Baderach, on the journey, when you left Egypt. Asher korcha baderach, they came upon you on the journey. Word korcha is an unusual word. Rashi has three interpretations of it. And they killed you. All the weary ones who were behind you. You were tired and weary. And the way Rashi reads this, he did not fear God. When you have rest and comfort, when you have rest and comfort from all your enemies from around you, in the land that Hashem your God will give to you, and nachalal rishta, a portion to inherit. You have to wipe out the memory of Amalek from underneath the heavens. Lo tishkach, do not forget, do not forget. And this is the commandment to remember Amalek and not to forget. Seems like it's two special commandments. First, I want to share a story that happened. One of the reasons why I went to Israel was because I completed a Torah for a woman, a widow, whose husband was killed in Gaza. And she asked me to write a Torah in her husband's memory. We had actually started the Torah together. I had started the Torah with her husband. Her husband was a close friend of mine. And I had started that Torah with him before the war started. We just wrote one verse. And so the day after he died, the day after he was killed, she asked me to complete the Torah. So I went and I spent Shabbos with her family and we did the siyum. And she said to me, I'm not going to go to shul on Parshat Zachor. I'm not going to go to hear that passage. And I said, why not? Why aren't you going? I wasn't questioning her. I just wanted her to explain it because I knew she wanted to explain it. So she said to me, Ki ani zocheret, which means because I remember. She's living with the tragedy, with the grief of what she's going through. Just like Joyce remembers the pain, the loss seems ever present in her mind, in her family's mind. This beautiful young woman, she remembers. She doesn't need to be reminded. The Zachor is for the rest of us. When God leaves us to rest from our enemies, we run the danger of forgetting. But this woman, she says she's in no danger of forgetting what happened to her husband. And that's our challenge, I think, on one level, is to remember to be connected to everyone. One thing I heard in Israel was I heard somebody who suffered loss in Israel in this war. He went to a family wedding and he said it was a very nice wedding, but he was devastated that they did not mention at the wedding the chayalim. They didn't mention the soldiers who were fighting or the captives. And it was as though the world had forgotten. So that's on a very basic level. Our responsibility as Jews is to remember, especially when God has left us in a secure place, when there's tranquility from our enemies, we have to remember those who were attacked and killed by our enemies. We have to remember that. That's our first basic obligation. I mean, we could get into the interpretations of Zachor, but at a basic level, our obligation is to remember. Remember what happened. Remember who has suffered the most. And always be connected. That's the first idea. The second idea I wanted to share with you that I heard was, I heard this from, I spent Shabbos in Chadera, and there was a little synagogue. I didn't even know the name. I think it was basically an apartment building. And at the bottom of the apartment building, there was a synagogue. There's like a synagogue every other block there. So in this synagogue, there were like 40 to 50 Sephardic Jews who were davening there. And I'm not Sephardic, so the davening is a little foreign to me. But I appreciated their hospitality. Anyway, so I davened with them. It was a beautiful davening. And the rabbi spoke. And they obviously loved their rabbi. And he spoke very nicely. I don't remember, I never knew his name. The davening took a very long time. The Sephardim davened for longer than the Ashkenazim. So I didn't stick around after the service to get his name. So the reason I'm telling you this is I'm going to quote him, but I don't know his name. And I don't really know the name of the synagogue. But this rabbi said the following. He said, on Purim, there's an obligation to give mishloach manot. We send gifts to our friends. We have an obligation to give matanot levyonim, to give gifts to the poor, to be used on Purim Day. If people don't know anybody who's poor to give money to, I highly recommend you go to the website of Yad Yehuda, it's a local food bank, and you give money to Yad Yehuda. So you can give it out to poor people. On Purim, there's a special law that if a poor person comes to you and asks for money, the rest of the year, if a poor person comes to you and asks for money, you're supposed to challenge, like verify, check it out to make sure it's accurate. You have to do your due diligence. But on Purim, if a person comes to you and asks for money, we're not supposed to ask. We're supposed to just give. We're not supposed to check. On Purim, we give. It's a day of giving. So said this beautiful rabbi, what's the relationship between Purim and Zachor? We'll see in a moment that Zachor is always read the Shabbos right before Purim. It's always read the Shabbos right before Purim. So what does Zachor have to do with Purim? And this is what the rabbi said. Now, I'm sure it's definitely impacted by the trauma that he and his community are undergoing. But he said the following. He said, when we give, we feel so good about giving. We feel good about ourselves. We feel good about the people we're giving to. And it can lead to a feeling of just the feeling of just happiness. The more you give, the happier you are. The more we give, the happier we feel. And you start to think how great the world is. We're all doing so wonderful. And you start to think that everybody in the world is wonderful. And it can lead to a sense of naivete. You start thinking everybody is wonderful. But Zachor reminds us that not everybody is wonderful. That don't think that just because you're doing something good, everybody you're giving to is also going to be good. Sometimes you give, and it has the opposite reaction. The people you give to want to hurt you the most. It's a sad thing to say, but it's true. Sometimes the more you give to somebody, the more that person wants to hurt you. And he said the people who were murdered the first on October 7th, they were the ones who gave the most to the people in Gaza. Like this man of blessed memory, Oded Lifshitz, he used to drive the Gazans to the hospital in Israel. And they came in, people like that, they invited the people from Gaza into their home. And many people who were invited into their home, they thought they were being friends with them. But really what they were doing was scouting out their homes in order to murder them. And like Naama Levi, when she was being kidnapped, she said, wait, I have friends in Gaza. Let me give you the numbers of my friends who you could call. So the point is that the reason why Zachor is right next to Purim is to remind us that yes, we have to give, but never forget while we're giving, never forget about the evil that exists in the world. Never forget that some people will react to our giving with jealousy, with hatred, with envy. This is the message that this rabbi said. And to me, it rang true. I know not everybody might agree with me, but that was a message that rang true. So now let me talk a little bit about this obligation of Zachor, and then we'll talk about some interpretations. So first of all, where does it come from? So the Gemara Megillah 18a tells us, remember, Zachor. What does it mean to remember? How do we remember? I might think remembering means just remembering in your heart, meaning just to remember that you have an obligation to remember. No, it says also, lo tishkach, do not forget. Well, forgetting is something that's in your mind. So what does remembering mean? So what does Zachor mean? So don't forget. That means don't forget in your heart. What does remembering mean? It means remembering with your mouth, like Joyce just did a few moments ago. Remembering means to verbalize it, to share, to tell, to talk about it. That's the obligation to remember. Don't forget means keep it in your mind. But remember means to verbalize it, enunciate it. And so the rabbis say, the Gemara in Brachos tells us that a dead person, generally speaking, I'm not talking about where the tragedy is overwhelming, but as a general rule, we forget about somebody who dies after 12 months. And so therefore, for this reason, the obligation is to read the Zachor once a year, every year. It says, remember, you might think you have to do it every single day. No, but because you typically forget about something that you don't do every 12 months, so therefore you have to remember it at least once a year. So Mordechai, from the book of Esther, and by the way, if anybody wants to join us, we're starting in our Tanakh class at 2:00 every day now. Until Purim, we're studying the book of Esther. If you email me or text me, I'll give you the link. It's 2 to 2:15 every day from Rabbi Gittler. Mordechai and his court instituted to read Parashat Zachor once a year, but they instituted that you should read it before Purim. Why before Purim? Because we know that we want to connect the wiping out of Haman to the Zachor, because Haman is a descendant of Amalek. How do we know that? It's called Hamana Agagi. And Agag was the king of Haman. Now, halacha is that we don't make a special blessing on this reading because it's destructive, and we don't make a blessing on something that's destructive. Another reason we don't make a blessing was said by Rabbi Chaim Palagi was because it was what's called a mitzvah that came about through a sin. As Rashi tells us that what's the reason why Amalek was able to attack? Rashi tells us if you are dishonest with your weights and measures, then you have to be afraid of the enemy. So Amalek came because we sinned, and that's why Amalek attacked against us. And on a deeper level, the Rashi is telling us that the enemies attack when we're not spiritually strong, when we don't know who we are, or we know who we are, but it's not good. So therefore, this is called a mitzvah to destroy Amalek, but they came about through a sin, because the Jewish people were either weak with respect to Torah, or they were not honest with weights and measures. Some say that there's other ways to fulfill this obligation. The Magen Avram is Rav Avram Gambiner. He wrote a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. He says that you could also fulfill this obligation. Really, people are supposed to go to synagogue, especially this Shabbos, just to hear Amalek. But he says you could also fulfill this obligation by the Torah reading on Purim Day. Because there it comes from the end of Bishalach, and it also talks about Amalek. So not everybody agrees with that. The Mishnah Berurah says, I don't understand. It doesn't mention this passage. It doesn't mention what Amalek did, that they came upon you on the road. It doesn't mention to wipe him out. So that's a dispute between Magen Avram and Mishnah Berurah. The Ravid is Rav Avram ben David of Poskier. He lived in Provence in the 12th century. He says, how do I fulfill remembering? How do you do remembering? That you say something in your mouth, that you verbalize it, meaning to say that you study the laws of Megillah. He takes a positive spin on it. So, meaning to say just mentioning Amalek is sufficient. And then what you should do is, you don't actually have to hear this passage, but you just have to study the laws of Megillah Esther, of the book of Esther. So too, similarly speaking, we have an obligation to remember the Exodus from Egypt. So some say you fulfill that obligation by reciting the Song of the Sea, what we call Az Yashir. Even though it doesn't actually mention the Exodus there, but it just mentions the splitting of the sea. So anyway, the obligation to remember and to so most are of the opinion that the obligation to read this passage. I'm curious, do they read this in your synagogues? If there's anybody who has a synagogue where they don't read this week, I'm curious. I wouldn't be surprised if some denominations decided to cancel this ritual because it's too militaristic, talking about wiping out the enemy. So probably they didn't want to do it. So it is a big one, though. You want to say something, Joyce?
I didn't quite understand the question. What is it that is read that maybe?
So there's a passage. I'm sorry for cutting you off. I'm sorry for cutting you off, Joyce.
You didn't.
Okay. There's a passage from Deuteronomy, chapter 25, 17 through 19, verses 17 through 19. That's called Parashat Zachor. So this paragraph must be read on the Shabbos before Purim. And every synagogue is supposed to read it. But I was wondering, maybe there are some liberal denominations who say we don't want to do that because we don't want to be so militaristic. We don't want to talk about our military obligations to wipe out the enemy.
Would it be read during the Torah service?
It's read as the maftir. for the Torah
Ah,
service.
okay, okay.
So instead of typically speaking, you read the maftir from the end of the portion, but here
Yes.
you just read we take out 2 Torah scrolls. Last week we took out 3 Torah scrolls. This week we have 2. One is for Tetzava, which is the weekly portion, and the second comes from Zachor, which is from Deuteronomy.
Well,
So
I don't know what our practice is, but now that you've brought
make
this
sure
to
they do it.
attention-
Make sure they do it so everybody can fulfill the mitzvah of Zachor.
Okay.
Send an email
okay.
to the rabbi and say, "Are you going to be reading Zachor this week? Can we please read it? Because it's a mitzvah. You want it. Once you're going to synagogue, you might as well get the mitzvah.
Right.
Technically speaking, even though I encourage everybody to daven with a minyan, that's not a biblical commandment. You're not missing a biblical commandment if you stay home. But if you don't hear Zachor, then you're missing a biblical commandment. So that's the most important thing that could be possibly done in the synagogue in terms of rituals this Shabbat. So you want to make sure that they read it.
It
Yeah,
is read
send an
in the
email.
conservative synagogue.
What'd you say, Morris?
It is read on the conservative.
So it's read, okay, Baruch Hashem, but not
17 through 19.
but not every conservative synagogue is the same. Some are different.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you for telling us that.
Okay,
Morris.
it's on my calendar. So
yeah. Let me know. Make sure it's read.
all right.
All
Thank
right,
you,
so
We'll
Morris.
see what they do.
we'll see what they do. So I'm going to let me continue here. Baruch Hashem. Basically, now that I put in my editorial, so the obligation to read is biblical obligation. And some say that you have to read it with a minyan. You can't just read it in your home, in your kitchen table, because the obligation to wipe out Amalek is specifically a communal obligation. You can't just do it on your own. It's a communal obligation. And so therefore it became a practice to read it to Shabbos before Purim. So we have the custom to read it once a year.
Rabbi,
Yes.
some people in Israel justify what's happening in Gaza, what Israel is doing in Gaza, on this portion to wipe out Amalek, and they say the Hamas is Amalek, and therefore there's an obligation to wipe it out. What do you think of that?
Okay, I think that's a great question. So the rabbis already told us that once Zachor, the king of Assyria, came, all the nations were mixed up. We don't know which nation is which. We don't know who's who. And so therefore, we don't have a specific person who's Amalek today. And so therefore, this law cannot be applied literally anymore. But on a symbolic level, it does certainly teach us that the Torah believes that there's good and there's evil. And when there's evil, we can't look away. The Torah tells us that there is evil that exists in the world. And we can't look away and we can't pretend that they're not evil. That doesn't mean that you have to apply the biblical prescription for evil, which is wiping out every single man, woman, child, baby. That's not, I don't know any rabbi today that would say that, but it does teach us that if there's evil, you have to wipe it out. So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, sure. Yeah, and Bruce or April?
I'm a little bothered by making Amalek the epitome of evil, because the way the Torah describes what Amalek did, they came and they picked off the stragglers behind us, which means that the able-bodied rushed ahead, did not show chesed to the elderly and the lame, did not take care of them. Rashi says that our problem is that we didn't keep honest weights and measures, but our problem was lack of hesed. We didn't care of our own weak. We left them to the enemies. And yet there's no expression of joint culpability here. It's like on October 7th, the Israeli IDF ignored warnings that this would happen. There was joint culpability, and yet we still make Amalek the epitome of evil when we ourselves were culpable in what happened?
I mean, there's a lot of things going on there in that statement, Bruce. First of all, the fact that the IDF made mistakes doesn't take away from the culpability of the people who attacked on October 7th. But
It was joint.
well, I mean, I wouldn't know it's joint. I don't know. I don't even want to get into that. I don't know that we're arguing, but I don't know that I would express it that way. But okay, let's get back. A few weeks ago, I might have asked this question when we studied Beshalach. How were there people who were able to be attacked? Wasn't there a cloud of glory? So Rashi says here that the people who were attacked were not, never says that they were the old and the weak. It says they were the ones who were nechashalim acharecha. They lack strength. But Rashi says because they sinned and the cloud threw them out of the sin. Threw them out of the cloud, of the protection of the cloud because of their sin. So these are the people who had committed a sin and therefore they were outside the cloud of glory. And then when they attacked, we read this in Parshas Beshalach at the end. God tells Joshua to go more. Moshe sends Joshua to go out from the cloud to protect these people. So yes, they were attacked, but they weren't forgotten, even though they were sinners. Joshua went out and fought against them and saved them. So I wouldn't say that was our sin. It was their fault that they were outside of the cloud. And then our ancestor Joshua went and saved them.
Saved them. Amalek killed them.
Well, he saved the rest. Amalek killed those who he killed, and Joshua went and saved the rest. Joshua went out and fought and protected them, or those who he could.
Where is that written?
Where is that explanation written?
Yes.
It says it right here in the Rashi. It says the cloud threw them out. And then it states earlier in the parashas of Beshalach, it says that God says to Joshua in Parashas Beshalach, or Moshe says to Joshua, in chapter 17, verse 9, choose for yourself men and go and wage war against Amalek. And Rashi says, it means go out from the cloud and wage a war against him. Rashi says in Ezekiel that the people who were outside the cloud were the tribe of Dan because they worshipped idolatry. That's what Rashi says in Ezekiel. But anyway, once they were out of the cloud because they did something to remove themselves from the community. And then Joshua went out and tried to save those who he could. So does that answer your question?
Answers it, doesn't convince me.
Okay, Baruch Hashem. So at least I answered it. Okay, so now continuing right along. So again, we're talking about the commandment to read this passage. Maimonides says the reason why we read it is to awaken with us the obligation to remember that evil exists in the world. Nachmani says it's to tell our children what happened to us, meaning to say that there's an obligation to tell the story to our children. So the question is, what's the difference? Whether or not you need to read it in public. Meaning to say Nachmanides is basically saying it's a family obligation to tell your children or sit around with your friends and talk about it, but you don't have to go into the synagogue specifically. But Maimonides is saying, since the main reason is to be ready for war, then it's a communal obligation to be ready for war. Judaism is not a pacifistic religion. It recognizes the need to be ready for war, which is so ironic because from the time of Bar Kokhba until Jabotinsky, there was never a Jewish army. So yet they're talking about this obligation to be ready for war, even though we never had a Jewish army for 2,000 years. The Vilna Gaon, he himself read the passage from the Torah. So there's an obligation for every single person to hear it. But the Vilna Gaon read it himself because he wanted to have that honor. Okay.
Rabbi,
What about
Rabbi,
women?
didn't Barak lead Deborah's general lead a Jewish army?
Yes, but that was in the Bible. But that was around 1,000 years or 1,200 years before Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba was in the 2nd century. From the 2nd century until Jabotinsky put together
I
a
see.
Jewish legion in the First World War, which my grandfather was a member of, there was no Jewish army. So that was
so that's the
almost
period of time.
2,000 years.
That's
And
the
yet we
period.
have this obligation.
Okay, now I understand where you're starting in.
Okay, good. Baruch Hashem. Okay. So what about women? Are women obligated to hear this passage? Are women obligated? So in the Sefer Achinuch, this 14th century Spanish work, he writes that women are exempt because since women are not obligated to go into battle, they're therefore not obligated to hear this passage of Zachor. And even though there are certain battles where the women do have to go out and fight according to the Chinuch Hayi against the 7 Canaanite nations, nevertheless, this is different. This is different. Anyway, even though women are not obligated, the custom throughout the Jewish world is that women come to hear the passage of Amalek. There's a custom to hear the passage of Amalek amongst the women, even though there might be reason to say women are not obligated in it. Are you trying to ask something, April?
Yeah, but nowadays when women do fight in the army, shouldn't they be obligated?
That's a great point. Maybe that's why women do have the custom to come nowadays. Very good point. That's a very good point. Anyway, what's the reason why we have to wipe out Amalek? What's the reason? So there's many, many reasons given. But the classic 3, we'll go over the classic 3 reasons. The first one is because it's a punishment for their bad actions, for what they did to us. Since they came out and attacked you, therefore you have to wipe them out. That's one basic reason. A second reason is to prevent them from doing it again. Meaning to say, it's clear to God that if they had the chance, they would wipe out all of us. So therefore, since they would wipe out all of us from young child to elderly person, therefore we have to act first. This is called the law of a rodev. Somebody's pursuing us to kill us, we have to act first. And it's clear to God, it's not a punishment, it's called survival. And this is the way we could survive, is by killing the ones who are going to attack us. And a third approach is, it's not a punishment, and it's not necessary in order for us to survive, but it's our obligation to uproot evil from the world. That all of the nations, the Ramban says, Nachmani says in his commentary at the end of Beshalach, all of the nations were trembling before God, but only Amalek came to fight with the Jewish people. So Amalek recognized that they could be a thorn in God. And so therefore, that's the third reason. Hold on, I see that there's a question here in the comments. Do some scholars teach that? Well, it's clear that the lesson of Megillat Esther is that the Jews had to unite because Haman says there's a nation that's scattered. But they did have an army in Megillat Esther, but that was under the permission of the king. Anyway, it's a good point. This mitzvah will not be in the Messianic times. Somebody's asked about the contemporary application of it. And the Rabbeinu Bechaya says that if you read it in the Torah, it says low, and the trop, the cantillation is low with a tipcha, meaning to say it stops. Tishkach, meaning to say in the future you will forget it. So this mitzvah in the Messianic era, we won't have to wipe out Amalek. There will be peace. This is a temporary commandment, only until the Mashiach comes. So we might finish it before Shabbos, and then we won't be reading. The Mashiach will come before Shabbos, and we won't read this passage this year. The Gemara in Baba Basra 21a tells us the following story. So actually, you know what? I don't want to read this story. It's going to be too long to go into it. Well, I'll just explain it. It says, Timched et Zachor Amalek, wipe out the memory of Amalek, but you could also read it, wipe out only the males of Amalek. So the Gemara has a story that Yoav in the Bible, his teacher taught him to wipe out only the males and not the whole memory of Amalek. This is how in the Bible, Agag, when Shaul lost the kingdom because he refused to kill Agag, who was the king of Amalek, and he also left alive some of the sheep and the cattle. So because he didn't follow this command exactly, as a consequence, Shmuel the prophet took away the kingdom from Shaul, and Shmuel directly killed Agag. Somebody, I think Stan was asking before about the contemporary application. After the Sabra Shatila massacre, Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein testified before the Knesset. And he said, why was Shaul punished for keeping the animals alive and for not killing Agag? Wasn't it an act of mercy? And he said, no. Once he deviated a little bit, if he had done exactly what God had said, then he wouldn't have been punished. But once he said, oh, have mercy on the animals, then why is he deviating only with respect to the animals? Then he shouldn't have applied the commandment at all. And so nowadays, since the commandment is not applicable, you can't say, oh, a part of the commandment, wipe out everybody. That's why Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein said that Sabra and Shatila was a great sin. So what does it mean in the verse? It says, wipe them out from underneath the heavens. I want to tell you something very significant. It says, mitachat hashamayim, underneath the heavens. It says in the verse, Timched Zachor Amalek, wipe out Amalek from underneath the heavens. What does that mean? That there should not be any grandchild for Amalek underneath the heavens. The Gemara tells us that the grandchildren of Haman studied Torah in Bnei Brak. So how did they accept his grandchildren? What's Bnei Brak? Bnei Brak is the center of Torah study today. And the Gemara, in the times of the Gemara, was also a center of Torah. How could they have accepted them? How could they have accepted them? So, weren't they supposed to be wiped out? So they have to come up with different explanations. But I have an explanation which is going to be shocking to you. But I'm going to share it anyway. Okay? I'm going to give you an explanation which you're going to be horrified by. But I'll say it anyway, okay? Sorry. Forgive me in advance if I upset you. Forgive me in advance. When I was in Israel this time, I saw tremendous outrage against the Haredim. Haredim are the ultra-Orthodox who don't serve in the army. They say, we don't want to go to the army. Our Torah study is more important. People have had enough of this, because why should their children die, their grandchildren go to the army, just so the Haredim can study Torah? They're living in the land of Israel. They have to serve in the army. So I think that those people who are living in the land of Israel and saying we have to study Torah instead of serving in the army are committing a tremendous sin. That's why it says you can be a descendant of Haman even though you're studying Torah in Bnei Brak. You can think you're doing the holiest thing in the world. Really what you're doing is you're just a descendant of Haman. Your Torah study is worse than useless. It's negative. It's negativity in the world. I saw people saying they would, I never seen such outrage, but I understand it completely. The justification. Why should they be exempt? And this is something that I definitely saw on my trip to Israel this time, this outrage. I saw a lot of beautiful things. I saw very brave men and women who are volunteering in the army. And then after they served in the army, they went and they volunteered to rebuild it. Well, let me pause for a second, the recording, because